Today on the Bourbon Bytes podcast, Buffalo Trace just dropped an Eagle Rare worth over $12,000. Elijah Craig has yet another PGA bourbon, and Booker's is back with its first batch of 2026. Then I have a bite-sized review of the new Knob Creek Blenders Edition. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bourbon Bytes podcast. I'm your host, Clifton, and this is the week of Thursday, April 23rd, 2026. I hope you all are having a fantastic week, and it seems to be a fantastic week in the world of bourbon news because we have a lot to talk about today. The first of which you most likely have probably already heard of, but Buffalo Trace has just announced a new 30-year-old edition of Eagle Rare. And before you get too excited, this bottle is retailing for over $12,000. This is the type of whiskey that makes non-whiskey people think we've lost our minds. So this new edition of Eagle Rare is actually the oldest age-stated bourbon that Buffalo Trace has ever released. Back in 2023, they released a 25-year-old version of Eagle Rare, so this is the continuation of their exploration of extended maturation. Now, like Eagle Rare 25, this was also aged in their mysterious Warehouse P, which has been their home for experimentation across the brand's lineup. So what's interesting about that is this series is designed to explore whether extended aging can enhance American whiskey in the same way that it does in more temperate climates such as Japan, Scotland, and Ireland. So I imagine they're doing a lot of things with temperature control here in this warehouse to make sure that this 30-year-old bourbon is hopefully not over-oaked. But let's be honest, if you're paying $12,500 for a bourbon, do you really care how it tastes? I don't know. This ultra premium world of whiskey is something that I've never really understood. Even before I was into whiskey, I would see, Macallan bottles going for tens of thousands of dollars. And to me, that just doesn't scream someone that loves to drink whiskey. That screams someone with a lot of money and maybe a lot of power and influence. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being influenced by the media, but I can't imagine a bourbon being worth $12,500. It is a beautiful bottle, as with all of these ultra premium bourbons. But to me, it seems a little bit like an excessive way to flaunt your wealth. They do say that Eagle Rare 30 is not simply about time, it's about what time it can reveal. They say aging whiskey in Kentucky comes with inherent challenges such as evaporation and barrel influence intensity, but they say that the environment within Warehouse P allows them to manage those effects, softening the extraction and preserving the nuanced flavor that defined ultra-aged bourbon. So it is good to hear that they're not just throwing whiskey in a barrel for 30 years and just hoping it comes out good. It seems like this is a very intentional release where they are experimenting with those elements that are very non-Kentucky. The reason that Kentucky bourbon is so intense and so flavorful, even at a young age, is because of those crazy climate changes that happen throughout the year, from winter to summer. The extraction of the barrel is what's causing all that. So when you have a temperature-controlled warehouse, like their experimental one, you can technically age whiskey for as long as you want. Of course, there's probably some caveats there as well, with it being new charred oak barrels versus reused casks like we see in Scotland and Ireland. But it is an interesting experiment. I just don't necessarily see it for the general consumer who would actually be curious about that. So if you are wondering the best way to get your hands on this new Eagle Rare 30, you can look no further than Bonhams, which is one of the world's most respected auction houses. They actually have 15 different curated lots, including one that is the complete collection of the Eagle Rare portfolio. That includes Eagle Rare 10, 12, 17, Double Eagle Very Rare, 25, and 30. It's also paired with a luxury experience at Stag Lodge, which is the Distillery's private invite-only lodge overlooking the campus. And that auction is going to go live this Friday at 7 a.m. EST. So if you are going to be bidding on that, that's probably the best chance to do it if you have that kind of money and are, wanting the VIP experience. I mean, I feel like if you're going to pay that much, you might as well go all out, right? And if you're looking for a guest to join you on that experience, well, I might clear my calendar just for you. Now, a little bit more relevant news coming to us from Buffalo Trace Distillery is the grand opening of their John G. Carlisle Cafe. It's going to be the distillery's first permanent dining destination. Now, this place is primarily focused on lunchtime service. It has a 4,900 square foot cafe and can seat up to 70 guests with additional seating on the patio. It says they have food like made to order sandwiches, salads, and desserts as well. And of course, classics like the Kentucky Hot Brown. Now, like other distillery site eateries, they are infusing the world of bourbon into their menu. They're having a bourbon bacon, a barrel aged coffee, a bourbon infused fudge topping and whipped cream, and more. They'll also have select cocktails featuring Buffalo Trace spirits available for purchase, including an old fashioned, a Wheatley vodka peach mule, and a Traveler whiskey Lucky Penny. I love to see this. I don't make it out to Kentucky that often, but visiting distilleries has become more than just doing the tour or visiting the gift shop and leave. It's about just spending time with people and just getting to understand the land and the culture behind it. I've heard some great stories about different cafes on site at all the main Kentucky distilleries, so it's nice to see Buffalo Trace get in on the action. Now, they're going to have a 3-week lineup of daily specials throughout the month of May, so if you are local, definitely check out the press release for this. You should be able to find it just searching John G. Carlisle Cafe. They're doing things like free meal Mondays, from the Archives open house event on Tuesdays, and fun things like Whiskey Wednesdays with complimentary samples of new soon-to-be releases all day, and much, much more. They basically have things going on every single day in May after they open. By the way, opening date is May 11th of this year. They're going to be open from Monday through Sunday from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. So definitely seems cool. I would love to visit. All right, well, we have yet another new release from Elijah Craig, continuing their tradition of releasing special PGA Championship bottles. Now, some of these have been great, others have been just kind of okay, but this is a celebration of the tournament's 108th year by releasing a 108 proof bourbon. So last year's release was bottled at 94 proof, so this is a pretty big jump up in proof. Now, as with some of these other releases, it's pulled from specific rick houses in the distillery, so this one particularly is from N&S. And that's a tribute to the historic Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, which I assume is where the PGA is taking place this year. I've actually really liked these in the past, especially the higher proof ones. I know that in some past years they've done some additional finishing on these releases, and those have really been the highlights to me. But I do love seeing a higher proof offering. I think it's kind of a nice way to try Elijah Craig at higher proof, but not quite barrel strength. So I'll definitely be seeking out a bottle. Retail on this is only going to be $36.99, so I think it's a very fair price for a special commemorative bottle. It has a really nice cork. It has a special label. As someone that doesn't necessarily care about the PGA, it's still a really good bourbon. I'm just an Elijah Craig fan, so getting a chance to try it at 108 proof sounds like a good time. So I'll be keeping an eye out for that. You'll probably get a review of it here soon on the podcast once I do. Another one that you may or may not get a review of on the podcast is the first release of Booker's Bourbon for 2026. This was announced back in March, but I'm just now starting to see it show up around the country. This is called the Big Easy Batch and is a tribute to one of Booker No's favorite city, New Orleans. And I love New Orleans, so that kind of caught my eye as well. This limited release is the 2026-01 batch. It's going to be aged 7 years, 2 months, and 15 days. And bottled at 129.1 proof with a suggested retail price of $100. So, yeah, still pricey, still typical Booker's age and proof. I will say I revisited my 2025 Bookers probably a couple weeks ago, and it was better than I remembered. I just think once they're up there in that price, I'm not going to seek out every single batch. But with this being a tribute to New Orleans, as, again, one of my favorite cities, I might pick this up for the novelty of that. I love the stories with these Booker's batches. You're buying it for not just the whiskey inside, but, the story behind it. At least I am. Because Booker's is always kind of meant to be a collectible piece, right? It comes in the special box, and the little card inside tells you about why they picked the name and the story behind it. So I think they're really fun, especially when they have a specific meaning that's important to you. I just am not at the point where I'm buying every single batch of Bookers like I used to, unfortunately. But I might pick this one up. If I do, I'll let you guys know. Or if you particularly think this is an amazing batch, let me know. Or if I should skip it, also let me know. Just basically, if there's ever an exciting batch of Bookers that you think is above the norm, reach out to me on Discord or shoot me an email, contact@bourbonbytes.com, and I'll pick it up and review it. I just am not buying every batch. So if there's an exceptional one, I'm happy to pick it up. But until then, I'll stick to the ones that speak to me, like the Big Easy batch. All right, well, before we get into our bite-sized review, I do have a couple of TTB labels to talk about. Of course, these are featured from Coming Whiskey on Instagram. Check him out and make sure to follow for the latest and greatest TTB filings. One of which is the new release of the Old Forester 117 series. Now, this one's kind of interesting because it is really just Warehouse L barrels. They say that this is the newest addition to the Brown-Forman Distillery, and they say its unique character stems from the barrel rick configuration with only 4 separate floors, but the ricks extend to 6 high. They say that this design results in distinct microenvironments that influence the maturation process. I don't think people are too excited about this. I mean, unless you know what that flavor profile is from Warehouse L, it's a little vague. They said this is going to come out in December of 2026. Proof is going to be 95 proof, and it's batch number 1. I'm curious if they're going to do other batches because they mentioned that this is going to be a micro environment within that warehouse. I'm curious to see if they're going to maybe release this whiskey at the different micro environments. I don't know. I'll keep an eye out. But the more interesting label I saw is a new Heaven Hill Bottled in Bond. Now, this is basically the exact same label as the Blue Label Bottled in Bond bourbon that they have available, but this is a red label. And it says this is a double mash. It says a masterful union of wheated and traditional Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey. So it sounds like they're combining their bourbon mash bill with the high rye with their wheated bourbon mash bill and doing a double mash at 9 years old. Of course, this is going to be 100 proof, so same proof as all Bottled in Bond bourbons. They say tasting notes of toasted oak and honey with gentle spice and bright citrus and a finish of rich caramel and baking spices. That sounds really good. I do like Heaven Hill's wheated mash bill. I like their rye bourbon mash bill. And I think this is a fun combination. I think maybe it'll taste somewhere between like an Elijah Craig or even a Larceny or Henry McKenna. I'm not really sure exactly what this flavor profile is going to be, but I will definitely keep an eye out for that. Again, no official announcement. This is just a TTB label filing. I will follow up as soon as I know more about that whiskey, but it's definitely going to be one of the most exciting releases of the year for me because I love that Blue Label Bottled in Bond. All right, well, that does it for this week's whiskey news. Now it's time to get into our bite-sized review. All right, well, I actually first talked about this week's whiskey a couple weeks back on my April 9th episode. I talked about what Knob Creek Blenders Edition was all about, but I'll summarize it for you here. This is a new permanent addition to the Knob Creek lineup where they're exploring different flavor profiles through blending. The one I'm reviewing today is Edition 01, and it's labeled a sweet bourbon blend. So this blend is specifically targeting those sweeter flavor profiles. And for a Knob Creek, that's pretty interesting because Knob Creek I usually think of as rich and dark. And maybe that's why they chose that for this release. They say on the side of the bottle, compared to the caramel and char of our classic 9-year bourbon, this experimental expression has confectionery notes from specially selected barrels. Enjoy vanilla and warm oak. So it doesn't sound like they're deviating too far from their flavor profile. It's just meant to focus mainly on those sweeter vanilla notes. And there's a little chart on the side of the bottle that shows you where the flavor is different from their standard releases. And it's definitely spiking more in the direction of sweet and vanilla, whereas the traditional looks like it usually spikes closer to the caramel, char, and even spice. Now, it is coming in with a specific age statement. This one says aged 10 years. However, that doesn't seem to be the main indication on this bottle. I could maybe anticipate that age statement going away because it's in very small font just below Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey. But the good news is it is higher proof than regular Knob Creek. It is 106 proof. So like I talked about when I announced this, there have kind of been some mixed things online about this whiskey. I knew I had to try it for myself as someone that just loves Knob Creek as a brand who has really tried almost every expression I've been able to get my hands on from Knob Creek. So I'm excited to see a new one, especially a permanent addition to the lineup. I had to give it a try and share my thoughts. So I'm very glad that I finally found a bottle. I've been enjoying it quite a bit, mostly in cocktails, which I'll talk about in just a little bit before we get into my final thoughts and score and everything. But today we're going to be trying it neat for the purposes of this bite-sized review. Let's go ahead and give it a nose. Well, lucky for us off the bat, this is smelling pretty similar to regular Knob Creek. I will say It's far less oaky, and maybe I'm just thinking of more of the older single barrels of Knob Creek, or not even the older ones, just the cast strength releases. Those to me are kind of oak bombs. This has some of that there. It's not completely gone, but it is a lot more sweet up front. And I'm thinking like vanilla is a pretty spot on note. It's not those darker, richer, caramel bakery notes that I sometimes get on a Jim Beam product. Instead, it's bright. It's a little, I don't want to say floral, but it's definitely more of like a vanilla scented candle on the nose. There's also a lot of corn sweetness there. It kind of has a little bit of a creamed corn kind of thing going on. That I think actually complements the vanilla. It's not like they're competing necessarily. It rounds it out a little bit more and makes it a little bit more of a natural smell versus like an artificial vanilla you might get on, like I said, a candle. But like I said, it's not devoid of that oak and char. It's still there. It's just kind of a little bit on the back burner compared to what I'm used to. There is a little bit of a fruitiness coming on the nose here, but it's really bright fruit. I'm actually thinking more of like a cranberry or even like a sugar-coated cranberry. And I think that's a thing. I think I've had that in a Christmas-themed cocktail before. But very, very bright, leaning towards that vanilla sweetness. So let's go ahead and give it a taste. Cheers. Oh yeah. Well, first of all, I like that it's high proof. With something like this, I would almost be worried they would kind of pull the Basil Hayden's path of being lower proof and just a brighter, sweeter flavor profile. But they are keeping this targeted for what I think is a core Knob Creek audience, those who like 100 plus proof whiskeys. And believe it or not, they were right. It is sweet. It's not as sweet as I was worried about. I think it's just more of a slight nuance compared to regular Knob Creek. It definitely leans less oaky, a little more bright. It honestly, you know what it kind of reminds me of? It reminds me of some of those special Jim Beam bottlings that aren't available anymore. One of my favorites was the Distiller's Cut, which is a 100 proof expression. I think it used to have an age statement on it too. And then, of course, the Repeal batch that a lot of people had as their favorite. This kind of leans a little bit in that territory, but with the character of a Knob Creek. I don't want to say this tastes like a Jim Beam product, like a core label product. This definitely has elements that make me think this is a Knob Creek product, which I think of as the more premium line. If we ignore the smoked maple Knob Creek release that doesn't belong in it whatsoever, that's a conversation for a different day. This definitely feels like a Knob Creek product, and I'm pretty impressed with it. It is up front with that bold vanilla flavor. That's hard to miss, but there's a little bit of a nuttiness that I kind of think is kind of what's reminding me of those Jim Beam releases. Now, do I think this is a very complex, nuanced bourbon? No, not really. I think it, is probably a little more elevated than standard Knob Creek 9-year, just the 100 proofer. But I'm not usually buying that one. I'm usually buying, like I said, the single barrel releases or some of their other one-off releases. Not that there's anything wrong with the regular Knob Creek 9. It's just I usually go for some of their, higher proof or more limited releases. Which brings up the question of price. So this Blenders Edition I got for about $45, which is about $15 more than the standard Knob Creek, and also about $15 to $25 less than some of the Knob Creek single barrel reserve picks. So it falls right there in the middle of the pricing of those two releases. And I think that's actually where it needs to be. I'm glad to see this isn't like some crazy expensive, $80 to $100 release of Knob Creek. I don't want it to put itself into the Booker's territory where I won't be buying them. But at $45, yeah, I'm excited to pick this up. I'm excited for future releases. Hopefully there are some that go a little bit different in direction. I do like those darker, oakier, toastier notes on a Knob Creek. So I'd love to see if maybe the next one is, one of these other flavor profiles they highlight on their back sticker. Because the label shows oak, char, smoke, caramel, vanilla, sweet, spice, fruit, and floral as the categories. So it sounds like it can lean any of those directions with these Blenders editions. But like I said, before I get into the score, here's the kicker. I've been enjoying the heck out of this bottle in cocktails. Whether it's an old fashioned or a Manhattan, I've used up almost half the bottle exclusively drinking it that way. So while this review is based on my neat pour impression, I'm going to consider the fact that this does amazing in a cocktail when I figure out my score, because I think that plays a factor into it. I'm not always drinking whiskey neat. I am most of the time, but I'm always looking for that go-to spirit-forward cocktail bourbon. And this checks a lot of those boxes. So that being said, I keep my score simple here, based on everything from price, availability, nose, palate, finish. Oh, I forgot to mention finish. Finish is medium. It's not anything crazy short or crazy long. It just hits right where it needs to be. It does bring up some of those darker notes that aren't at the forefront of the palate on the finish. So you do get a little bit of that oak and that char on the back end. So I appreciate that those show up back there. But anyways, in terms of score, I think this is a hit from Knob Creek. I think it's a great addition to the lineup. It gives me something to fill that void of not picking up every Booker's batch, but trying different blends at a very reasonable price. So with that being said, I'm going to give this an 8 out of 10. You know, it's not something that I'm going to reach for regularly as a neat pour, but there's nothing wrong with it as a neat pour. It's definitely a step above the Knob Creek 100. Not quite as good as some of those single barrel selects, but pricing, it makes total sense where it's at. But I will be buying multiple bottles of this as a cocktail whiskey because I love a spirit-forward cocktail, and so far this Blender's Edition has stood up to every single cocktail I've put it in. So for me, 8 out of 10 is a shelf recommendation. Definitely buy it once. If you love it, buy multiple bottles of it. Definitely give this a try if you see it on the shelf because you're not really taking big risk. You know, if you like Knob Creek 100, this is $15 more and higher proof and a cool story. So definitely give it a try. Let me know what you think. I'd be curious to hear what you all think of it. But that does it for this week's episode. Thank you all so much for listening. I also want to give a shout out to our newest Byte Club member, which is your way to support the channel for as little as $2 a month. Huge shout out to Wayne, who is our newest Bourbon Bit, which is the $2 tier. At that tier, you get access to our full membership page where you get early access to podcast episodes when I can do them in time, chances to vote on upcoming episodes and whiskeys I drink during those episodes and polls just like I did last week on YouTube, and just an inside look into the behind the scenes of the channel. So if you want to support the channel like Wayne, you can go to bourbonbytes.com or patreon.com/bourbonbytes, wherever you feel the most comfortable supporting, and look into those tiers because there are some really great rewards for our incredible Byte Club members. So thank you, Wayne. Thank you to the Byte Club. Thank you to my bourbon daddy, Donnie Webb. And until next time, this has been the Bourbon Bytes Podcast, a whiskey podcast with a gaming twist. Cheers, and I'll talk to you guys next episode.